Hi and welcome to part two of this explainer video about the Embracing Risk framework. And obviously if you haven't seen part one, go back and have a look at that. It gives the big picture. And in this one, we're going to be going through the specifics of the artifact that's developed or the model that's developed to anchor the process. So I'm actually starting sort of in the middle there in that green box that you can see. So the idea, as I talked about or introduced in the other video, is we're focusing on what we do to manage risk rather than whether we were safe. What that looks like is a bunch of sort of artifacts, systems, processes, and traits. And literally, this comes from asking people, and ideally as many people as possible, what actually contributes to safety. And this is a question that's asked through engagement. So just to be clear, this sort of strategy we're talking about here is explaining the model, but not necessarily the order that it happens in. And I just wanted to talk about this first because it gives the best idea about what this actually looks like. So literally what this process involves is going out and collecting raw data. So you ask as many people as possible what contributes to safety, and people talk about all sorts of cool things like, you know, themselves. They say things like awareness, training, systems, procedures, rules. They don't say paperwork very often, but they'll say procedures and rules. I say they, I'm talking ideally mostly about frontline personnel. They might talk about equipment and the right tools for the job. They will talk about other really cool things like care, culture, support, communication, planning, listening, learning. Like these are all things that we do that, you know, directly contribute to safety. There's often some conversation about risk, but it's not prominent, and I'll talk about why that needs to get added in. It's just sort of so intuitive that it's not thought of. But really, what we're trying to do here is, because we think we've got a pretty good foundation of hazard management already, we're trying to then move beyond just, you know, what keeps people safe is overhead protection or having the right vehicle or like a, you know, a safe chair. That's part of it, but it can't be all of it. It's got to be broadly at an organizational level, what are we doing to tackle risk every day? And so we ask that question. You then collate that together. Like the simplest way I've done it is literally taken all that data that's come from post-it notes, stuck it in a Word document and done a word cloud. And then that develops into themes, and then eventually it can turn into statements. And so the end result of this are statements that describe what safety looks like on a day-to-day basis. Now, what they're actually describing is how we manage risk, but it is framed around this idea of a safe day, because I guess I still, you know, find that organizations want to anchor to that. I know at times this may seem contradictory, because what I'm talking about here is talk more about risk than safety, and here we are saying, what does a safe day look like? But that's about the anchoring of it or the priming of it. In practice, what we're talking about is what we do, and that's an unusual frame, because as I said, if I ask people, were you safe, they, you know, nearly always refer back or defer back to, you know, the outcome of it. So this is about reframing to that middle ground in there, away from like, yeah, to, you know, what does it look like? I'll show you a couple of examples for some clients where this is the model that they've developed. So those statements get ideally anchored with a semiotic, with some sort of icon. As much as possible, those semiotics should not be traditional safety views. They should be about people and things that we do. And then there's a descriptor provided with it. And the descriptor gives it shared meaning. This is exactly the same format that's used for organizational values or vision, where sort of a short statement is provided and then a description is given to kind of manage shared understanding of it. And in this way, I think what we're doing is providing a more meaningful idea about what safety looks like, or a more meaningful idea about what we do to manage risk every day, and it elevates it and brings it really broadly across the organization. They are measurable, but only qualitatively. Most of these are not measurable quantitatively, and that goes back to this broad idea of, I'm not sure that safety is measurable. I know that you can maybe measure some aspects, but you definitely can't measure most of it quantitatively. And if you do, you'll have a trade-off of typically end up measuring activity, not quality. And so this accepts that. I'll talk about that in the next video, but this accepts that there are some things that you can't measure quantitatively. So this model becomes the safe day model, maybe called something else, just that's what we've been calling it so far. And then this is where we then revise and shift other systems and activities to better support to the way the organisation tackles safety and risk. So this becomes the framework for strategic planning. So if you think these are the 5 or 6 key things for safety, then that's your strategic planning. I just realised I sort of forgot to call it out in there. You will hopefully notice in both of those and in the earlier slide, there is an element in there about risk. And look, that still is referring to kind of hazard risk and managing hazards. And that's because it's got to be in there. We don't want to drift away from the idea that safety is still about managing hazards. And we want to be able to pick up on near misses and luck and that sort of stuff. So that's why it's still in there. And it's why for strategic planning, it's still really important that you focus on risk. But we also want to focus on communication or support or cultural listening or learning or planning or whatever it might be. And my experience so far has been that while there are similar themes between organisations, there are also subtle differences in language, and there is so much value in engaging. I sort of, it's my own, I admit this myself, that I thought it would be more generic, and it's not. Different organisations have their own language. That's not a surprise, but it comes out in this sort of model. And the power of being able to go back to the organisation and say, this is what you told us was important for safety is so strong. I think it's such a good story to be able to tell. So yeah, the strategic planning should align around it. I've been playing with this idea of like a risk library, and all that means is moving the anchoring or priming of safety away from kind of safety rules and procedures, the safety management system, and moving it to this idea of we've got this library or sort of bank of information of this is where we store all our risk information. This is where all our support goes to help people make good risk decisions. Some of that will still be in the form of a safety management system and procedures and forms, but some of it might be videos or posters or forums or learning or, who knows what, but it's just shifting the kind of, it's tackling this anchor that when we think about sort of safety, people associate it with compliance and rules, and we're trying to shift it to safety is actually about risk. The model also becomes part then of sort of supporting critical risk thinking for refining and decluttering. So these revised systems of work that come out of it, that we declutter, can we refine, can we simplify? Now that's part of a broader model, particularly around the fragility work and where we're flooding people with too much stuff. So the idea is this model becomes the critical thinking tool. Does that system, formal system, help us tackle that? Now, one of the other things I'll talk about in the next video is embracing some thinking. So some thinking around human psychology and psychology of risk, which includes things like it's called bounded rationality. There's only so much data that people can take in. We can flood people with too much information. So that's where we come back and say, well, maybe we're better off having a smaller checklist or fewer signs or less frequent paperwork. So there's some linkages across the board that come from solid science and solid thinking. This should be the framework for investigations and learning. So rather than using a distinct model like ICAM or whatever, it's like, well, this should be the model. This is where you start. You still need investigative techniques, but you start here to make it more integrated. This could be used for contractor management. So where typically we might ask for a bunch of stuff from contractors up front and they send it all in, and maybe somebody looks at it, maybe they don't. You might ask your contractors to complete a one-pager, which is explaining, they explain to you how they are going to do these things on your site. How are you going to plan? What systems are you going to use? What's your communication going to work like? What are your critical risks? And they tell you what they're going to do. It's much more meaningful for them. It's much more meaningful for you. It's much easier to assure against it or audit against it and have a conversation against it. Imagine doing a pre-start with a contractor where it's like, right, this is what you said you'd do. It's sort of like where they provide a SWMS or a risk assessment, but that's narrowed down nearly all the time just to hazard stuff and sort of more pure safety, whereas this is more the way they're going to organise the work. You can still then drill into what are the key risks and what are the key controls, and they might tell you for the risk section, they might refer to a SWMS or a risk assessment. So you could refer to that as well, but it's a bit more holistic and I think a bit more meaningful. I think that this model can then become an aligned framework for due diligence and assurance. The idea is, from an assurance point of view, which is really, for me, are we doing what we think we're doing or are we doing what we say we're doing? At the site level, it's this question, was today a safe day? And I think that a model like this can then be used to more meaningfully answer that. In other words, not just like, oh yeah, or we made it home, but did we communicate? Did we manage our risks properly? Did we use the systems that we were meant to? Did we learn and listen? Did we plan well? Whatever it is, you've got to. It's more complex, but a more meaningful way to sort of self-assess or assure. You can also use it, by the way, for pre-planning and risk assessing ahead. But senior leaders and sort of middle management, anybody else, can use the same model to go, are we doing what we think we're doing? Are we planning? Are we communicating? I think at a senior level, you would use this model to do due diligence. So senior leaders would be given the task of, say, learning. So not assuring at a senior level. I think it would be about, for due diligence, for example, it's go out and learn. Are we doing what we think we're doing? How does this work? How does planning work? How does communication work? How do our systems work? What are our critical risks? So you give different senior leaders the job of learning as much as they can about one of these elements and then reporting back. And this might take 3 months, but then reporting back in a narrative style. Much more rich information. Yes, it takes longer. Yes, it's more complex, but it's so much more meaningful when they come back and say, here's what I learned about planning, about what we thought we were doing and what I actually learned. This is sort of where it does cross over, by the way, to sort of like a HOP or a safety 2 thinking of, work as planned, work as done. We're asking senior leaders to first of all accept that might be the case and be curious first. And curiosity is a fantastic cultural tool, and it fits in with some other models out there as well. This is a tool or a way of thinking that can help that decentralized risk management thinking and safety thinking and empowerment. So, a worker is on the edge of like, oh, is this, now remember that the language wise, and I'll show you this in the next video, it's not, is it safe or not, but is it too risky? Is this an acceptable risk? How do we feel about it? And that can be a really, like most risk decisions are made pretty subjectively. So the idea is this model can give a little bit of structure to that. Well, do we have the right people? Do we have the right equipment? Have we got enough tools and systems to support us? What's our communication like? Just asking the question, do we think we've got the right mix of people? That helps structure a little bit more people going, you know what? Actually, now that we've asked these questions, no, we shouldn't do it. Or actually, no, I think we're okay to go ahead. So it's providing a little bit of structure around that, which can help with empowerment. And more consistent thinking in that way. As I said, it helps with deciding what's acceptable and what's reasonably practicable. Now, the model can't do this thinking for people, but when people are thinking, is this an acceptable risk? Like, yeah, sometimes we give them a risk matrix and there's a number, but most risk thinking is not done in a risk matrix. So again, the model gives a little bit of structure for it to help them. They're like coming at the end going, no, we feel really confident that sort of, we've got it nearly all under control. People are probably the thing we're most worried about because we're one person short, but this is what we're going to do to tackle it. That's a really good conversation around risk versus actually we're 2 people short and we don't have the right equipment. No, I don't think we should do it. I think the model also then prompts us to think, do our leaders have the capacity and the capability to roll this out and implement it? So there may be some upskilling needed there. And beneath this, I think that this sort of framework and thinking can better support high reliability organizing thinking and chronic unease and the detection of weak danger signals. So that's a whole nother body of work there. But essentially, high reliability organizing thinking came out of social psychology originally, a guy called Carl Wieck, and now Wieck and Sutcliffe. And HROs are organizations that are better at picking up weak danger signals, so early warning signs that are hard to detect, weak danger signals, and responding better at a local level. I feel that there would be a correlation between systemic breakdowns in the things identified in the model and those things being weak danger signals. Breakdowns in communication, breakdowns in plannings, consistently having not enough people or not the right tools, consistently having luck and near misses. Now that's the stuff we get closest to identifying through formal systems like reporting, but I think we can't rely on that reporting system. It just clearly doesn't identify enough. For me, being a HRO, it is a set of traits. It's not a systems solution, it's a cultural solution or strategy. And so I think that this model helps organizations and leaders talk more about and therefore think more about these proactive trait systems, processes and activities, and therefore be slightly better at identifying systemic breakdowns in them, especially where you've got senior leaders where their due diligence task is to learn about them. And what they come back and learn about is, wow, we think we're here and we're actually here. That should worry us. Is that breakdown in communication actually a weak danger signal. So not systemized, but it still is a semi-systemic approach because of the model. So that's just sort of a summary of what it looks like in terms of the model itself. There's obviously a bunch of work underneath it, both before and afterwards, that supports it, but that's the main artifact. So thanks for watching so far, and in the next video, we'll go into a bit more detail about what that shift in organizational sort of language and focus looks like. Thanks.